Let's start. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining Scott and I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And we are doing our second panel. I would like to thank everybody for listening to our first live panel on Unorthodox. Scott, I think we had over 10,000 views.
Yeah, it's true.
Thanks everybody for watching, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody being here today as well. Today's panel, we brought back Sara Schapiro, and we have two other experts with us who I am going to introduce. The topic for today is going to be on male sexuality, masculinity. I know that's a very broad topic. The reason why we decided to do this is that the Unorthodox episode was very popular. There was a lot of talk about premarital education and the expectation based on Este's experience, the expectation to go from no sexual experience to everything in one night, and the difficulties that she encountered and what we can do to make premarital education better. But what we also thought was necessary to focus on the experience of men, based also on the experience of Yankee, but also so many men who, one of the things that many women have written to us over the years that we've been doing our podcast is that they were told by their college teachers that their husbands will know what to do. Men are just innately sexual, and they will know exactly what they want and what you want, and they will come all prepared, so you don't have to worry. We know that to not be the case. The other reason why we wanted to talk about male sexuality, Scott, you and I did our very, very first episode on basically what we identified as an existential conflict for young men. Not just young men, but the idea of male masturbation, the reconciliation of its apparent prohibition with the kind of emerging hormonal, physical, psychological development of sexuality. So for those reasons, we've brought our experts to talk more about this. There's one other surprise that we have for you, but I'll let you, Scott, tell our readers, our listeners. Okay. So first, let me introduce our panel, unless
Please.
You want to go ahead and, okay, let me introduce the panel. So first we have Sara Schapiro-Halberstam, who was at our first panel. Thanks so much, Sara, for coming back and sharing your expertise. Sara is a psychotherapist and a certified AASECT sex therapist in New York City, where she practices individual therapy and sex therapy. She's well-versed on issues related to the religious community and specifically the Jewish Orthodox community. Sara studied the psychology of men, masculinity, and sexual infidelity. And she recently published a peer-reviewed paper on treating men with borderline personality disorder and out-of-control sexual behaviors. So thank you, Sara, for joining us. We also have representing our Israel experience, Rabbi Hananel Ross. Ross is married to Smadar and a father of two. He's a psychologist and a rabbi. And he's a couples therapist, and he is also a researcher of sexuality and masculinity. His master's thesis was devoted to studying the experience and meaning of sexuality in religious men, specifically the modern Orthodox or the national religious population. Hananel devotes his time to learning as well as teaching, and he recently opened up a Facebook page, which in Hebrew is called Lihiot Gever, which means to be a man. And then we also have Dr. Shai Krug. Shai, thank you for joining us as well. Shai is a clinical psychologist and an AASECT certified sex therapist at the James J. Peters VA Medical Center in the General Outpatient Department and the Sexual Health Clinic. And he also has a private practice in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Dr. Krug completed his postdoc fellowship in the assessment and treatment of PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, and a postdoctoral certificate in sex therapy from the Buehler Institute. Dr. Krug specializes in trauma, anxiety, mood, sexual disorders, and couples therapy. And in his spare time, He is also a professional magician. So thank you, Shai, for joining us as well. Take it away.
Okay, Talli, before we delve into today's topic, I want to thank all of our listeners, first of all, as you mentioned, to listening to and watching Intimate Judaism. I'm very proud to announce that this past month has been our biggest month ever for the podcast, never mind the YouTube views. And that's very exciting, given that, in particular, during coronavirus, podcasts have been maybe one of the first things to go off of people's regular menu of listening. So to have the highest, our best month ever is really something very exciting. So we want to thank all of our listeners for being a part of that. It's because of you, our listeners and our viewers now, that Intimate Judaism has become a real success. Please continue to help us by sharing, and by so doing, you'll help people all over the world open up discussions about sexuality, intimacy, and Judaism, discussions which Talli and I strongly believe are really, really necessary. Make sure you visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. Please send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Also, make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com as well as tallirosenbaum.com. And the surprise, which Talli mentioned before, is that we're going to have a class, which is actually spearheaded and really the springboard of the class is coming from this particular podcast, a class about masculinity, male sexuality, and Judaism. There'll be more details about that coming up soon. If you want to hear more about that or want to join that class, I believe it will be a 4-part class. You should write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com, and we'll be sure to send you the information as soon as it's available. So, Talli, before I pass the moderator's hat over to you, I want to open up with a couple of statements of Chazal, of our sages, which demonstrate that the sages of the Talmud were very well aware of the power of male sexual desire, as well as the need to create boundaries to control it. There's a very real acknowledgement in the Talmud that sexual drive in men is quite strong, along with that simultaneous recognition that halakha, Jewish law, does not allow us to simply acknowledge that and say, well, then I can't control it. We're expected to control it, and there are supposed to be boundaries that are built up for it. And this appears in numerous places in the Talmud, but nowhere, I think, more obviously than at the end of Masechet Kiddushin, Tractate Kiddushin, which deals with a lot of things, but primarily with marriage, on Daf Pei Aleph, Amud Aleph, and Amud Bet, which is page 81A and B. There are a number of stories there which are brought up in the context of Yichud. The Mishnah there talks about the prohibition of an unmarried man and woman being alone together out of the fear that they might do something which is a violation of halakha. They may be intimate with each other when they're not allowed to be. After that Mishnah presents that basic halakha, that basic Jewish law, numerous stories are presented. I want to paraphrase a couple of them. Okay, the first one is the story of Rav Amram Chasida. Interesting, that name means the pious. Rav Amram Chasida, he was someone who redeemed captives, apparently. He lived in the city of Naharda. And the Gemara tells us that he brought some captives, or some captives were brought into his attic, and he then removed the stairway or the ladder to the attic in order to allow these women captives who had been redeemed into his custody and his care to have their privacy. Now, one woman passed by the aperture, some sort of opening in the attic, and the way the Gemara explains it is her face was shining light down. Rav Amram, now I'm just saying what the Gemara says, grabbed the ladder, and the Gemara then says pointedly, this was a ladder which normally 10 people couldn't move. He moved it himself. He moved it over and started climbing up the ladder to go and obviously do something improper with this captive woman, or this formerly captive woman. When he got halfway up the ladder, he suddenly spread out his legs, I guess realizing what he was doing, and started screaming, "There's a fire in Amram's house! There's a fire in Amram's house!" The rabbis came running, and when they saw there was just Rav Amram on a ladder trying to hold back his inclination to climb the ladder, they said, based on your translation, either you scared us or you embarrassed us. To which Rav Amram replied, better you be embarrassed in Amram's house than you be embarrassed by me forever in the world to come. And then the Gemara has an interesting coda by mentioning that Rav Amram wasn't actually lying by saying there was a fire, because he asked that his evil inclination appear to him, and it appeared as a pillar of fire when it emerged from his body. So that's the first story. They said, based on your translation, either you scared us or you embarrassed us. To which Rav Amram replied, Talli, I think your Facebook Live is... Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Rav Amram then, by mentioning that Rav Amram wasn't actually lying by saying there was a fire. I think you have to turn off your Facebook.
I turned it off. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, the Gemara then continues with two more stories. One story of Rabbi Meir and one story of Rabbi Akiva. Now, understand who these are. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva are not just among our greatest sages. They are effectively in the Mishnah, the two central figures. They're the Tanaim, the Mishnaic sages, through whom the entire tradition we have now travels. They are really the source. We say every Mishnah is really based on Rabbi Meir, who got it from Rabbi Akiva. There are two parallel stories. I won't say both of them. I'll just do the first one of Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Akiva's is almost identical. Rabbi Meir used to scorn people who couldn't control their sexual urges. Then the Satan, read it as his evil inclination, appeared to him as a beautiful woman on the other side of a river. At that point, Rabbi Meir looked and there was no boat, so he climbed over a rope or something, on some sort of rope with a thin beam across the river to try and fulfill his desire with this woman. When he was halfway across the river, the woman disappeared. And Rabbi Meir said, if it weren't for the fact that heaven protected me, I wouldn't be worth anything. In other words, I would have actually gone ahead and done it. And Rabbi Akiva's story is almost identical. The only difference was he was climbing a palm tree rather than crossing a river. The final story is the story of Rabbi Chia bar Ashi. Rabbi Chia bar Ashi used to say Tachanun, the prayer where one puts his head down. And as he would put his head down, he would say, may the merciful one protect us from the evil inclination. His wife one day heard him saying that. And in hearing him say that, she was surprised because they had not been intimate in several years. She assumed, as Rashi says, because he was an old man. So what kind of evil inclination is he worried about? Obviously, there's something else going on. So one day she dressed up and paraded, so to speak, in front of him as he was learning in the garden. When Rabbi Chia bar Ashi asked her who she is, she answered, I'm Charuta, which was the name, according to Rashi, of a well-known prostitute. The name also, importantly, however, means freedom. And as she was walking back and forth in front of him, he propositioned her. She then asked him to get her a pomegranate. The details don't matter. And it sounds like, though the Gemara doesn't say it explicitly, that he had his way with her and they were intimate. Later on, he came home. He saw his wife lighting the oven, and he climbed in. And she said, what are you doing? And he told her the whole story. And she says, don't worry, it was me. And he said he didn't believe her. She brought him a sign, perhaps the pomegranate. And then he said, it doesn't matter. The fact is, I tried to sin. And he actually afflicted himself for the rest of his life and died in that affliction. So here, Talli, I'm going to pass this over to you. I've said enough about these texts. I just want to say a few points that emerge from these various stories. The first point is that male desire is not seen in the Talmud as something which is exclusive to wicked people or to weak people. It is something which is part and parcel of our greatest sages of all time, and not in sources I quoted today, but elsewhere, there are even implications that the greater the tzaddik, the greater the righteous person, perhaps even greater the desire for sex. The second point is that the rabbis in these cases didn't simply have this desire and run away. In every case, they either gave in partially or gave in entirely. In the case of Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, admittedly it was his wife, but as far as he knew, he was going all the way with this prostitute. In the case of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, they stopped in the middle, but only because God protected them, and they acknowledged that they otherwise would have sinned. And the first case of Rav Avram Chasida, he started and stopped himself in the middle with the help of his friends by calling them into the room. They didn't just run away or ignore their desire. It was something which they were basically had a hard time overcoming, if they even did overcome it. And also, I want to mention, in no case do any of these rabbis say, well, it's really, really hard to resist, so therefore that's a good excuse. You can't blame me. They all felt terribly guilty, which emphasizes the point that even though we acknowledge male sexual desire and the need to control it, we also say that the boundaries that are there are really important. And without those boundaries, you can't just say, well, it was really strong, so, what can I do? They were really upset with themselves. They all said, I wouldn't be worth anything had I gone through with it. So that shows both the desire or the importance of boundaries, as well as acknowledging the fact that the desire is in some ways really overwhelming. And two final points, and then I'll hand it over to you, Talli. I think it's just important from a literary perspective or a psychological perspective to note that the Yetzer Hara appears either as Satan in the case of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, or in the case of Rav Aram Chasida as a pillar of fire. And finally, in the case of Rav Chia bar Ashi, as this prostitute whose name is Freedom. So that probably would take an entirely different shiur or an entirely different episode to discuss what it means freedom, what does fire mean in these contexts, but clearly it's something which is very, very strong, and there's lots to discuss there when it comes to balancing male sexuality with setting up boundaries.
Thank you so much for that, Scott. And I think that these Gemarot, these Agadic stories, have so much value in terms of kind of putting out there the tremendous power of male desire. And there's so much that we can learn, but there's also so many questions that arise about what are we learning, and what are our sons learning about the power of male sexuality. You know, we hear stories about the shame, about the guilt, about the power. And there's also, what we also know is that in addition to sexuality being experienced like it is described here in these agadic stories as so powerful that it can cause you to act in a way which is beyond how you would want to act, we also know that the Torah expects for men to be sexual with their wives. You know, it's actually a positive commandment to provide your wife with sexual pleasure and to give her her ona, her time. So what we are dealing with here are many, many questions that arise about the development of male sexuality. How can men develop a healthy sense of themselves when their existential conflict is about that very strong pull as demonstrated in these stories? And also acknowledging that this is what boys are learning. This is what girls to some extent are learning as well about the power of male sexuality. The other point that I'm going to raise as well with our panelists is that along with these stories about the power of sexuality is the existential conflict with the lust-love split. The stories are about prostitutes and about people who are not their wives. These men are not having these, in fact, Rabbi Achia bar Ashi didn't even have sex with his wife, which is, you know, it's a positive commandment, and he's a great rabbi, and he's busy grappling with his Yetzer Hara, but he's, in doing so, his wife is neglected. And so I think I do want to start off the discussion with you, Sara, and if you can say something about this perhaps ancient or modern day, what we know as the Madonna whore complex or the love-lust split, and talk a little bit about that from your perspective and your experience as well as your research.
So the story, the way that I understood it, definitely seems to me that there was a challenge with integrating love and lust. And Freud said, where men love, they cannot desire, and where they desire, they cannot love. And the way that I understand this is that men often tend to see their wives as somebody who's pure and mothering. And because they have scripts that started out in adolescence or even earlier, whenever they learned about sex, they now see sex as something that's dirty, and their own desires and their own sexual inclinations as dirty, and something that shouldn't be put onto their wives, who they see as pure, but should be split off to a sex worker, a mistress, a prostitute, or, you know, anyone else but their wife. So this is one of the reasons why some men find it easier to have sex with sex workers rather than their wives. It's not because they hate their wives or they're trying to hurt their wives. That's a separate group. These are men who do respect their wives, and it's often subconscious how they feel about sex and about their wives. And they find that when they're trying to be intimate with their wife, it's a lot more challenging, it's a lot more difficult to tap into their sexual desires, and it's easier to have sex with someone else.
Okay, thank you for that. I think I want to go to Hananel next. If you could kind of comment on that love-lust split in terms of your experience as well as your research, and maybe you can present a picture. I mean, if just to kind of sum up what Sara was saying, Sara, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to you for 1 second, just to, is it your experience that many of the men that you see do have extramarital relationships? Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, so in my work, many of the clients that I see are having extramarital relationships, as well as the research that I've done. I would say it's about 20% of Jewish religious men and women who endorse that they've had affairs in the past.
Okay.
The work hasn't been published yet, but it's research
Coming from this place of splitting, as you put it.
That's the way that I understand it, specifically with my clients. I don't generally hear I hate my wife or I'm doing this to hurt her. I will hear that sometimes, but that's a separate group. Very often it's just this really confused experience of, I don't get it. I like her, I respect her, she's a good mother, but for some reason it's just so hard to have sex with her. I have to get myself into the zone, versus I meet a stranger or a woman seduces me and it just comes so naturally and it's so easy for me.
Okay, so I think that this really does segue into what you might have to comment on this, Hananel, because what you're raising, Sara, is something that probably cuts across cultures sociologically about what we expect from men. We expect from men to be the ones who initiate sex, who want sex, who ask for sex, who know all the rules about sex. And in fact, they are quite vulnerable to their own lack of self-esteem that they may encounter in themselves. And this also may lead to a situation where when you go to a sex worker, you don't have to work hard, you get taken care of. There are other elements to that we need to be able to understand in the context of the work that we do. But moving on to you, Hananel, who I lost right now, I don't see you anymore. I'm sure you're somewhere in here. Can you raise your hand? Because I don't know why you're not showing up, but Hananel, you there?
I think he has to come back on, Talli. Why don't we go to somebody else, okay?
Oh, okay, so I guess we lost you. So until Hananel comes back on, Shai, perhaps you want to comment on this from your experience as a sex therapist in terms of the experience of men or the expectation that we have from men, and what that is for them in terms of their own sexual functioning, their own sexual desire, etc. Shai, do we need to unmute you? Go ahead.
Shai, you there?
No, okay, now you muted, and now you can, okay, now you're unmuted, now you can speak. Go ahead.
There's no sound.
Okay. Did you connect to your audio? You might need to connect to your audio if you have not done that yet. And meanwhile, we'll go back. Okay, and here's Hananel. So meanwhile, you work on that. And Hananel, did you, okay, now unmute. And sorry for the technical trouble. Okay,
yeah.
Hananel, go ahead.
I apologize, my computer got too excited and collapsed.
Okay.
We've all been there.
Yeah. So I think splitting is a quite common phenomena, but I will emphasize a different picture that I met during my research, which I talked to men, to married men, and what I've heard from them is that they wish to integrate their sexuality in many different ways. And I think the main way is that they wanted to be joined with their wife, like they wanted to have a mutual experience. And when it wasn't the case, for example, when the wife didn't really want and they felt that they're getting a favor, so they felt bad. They really didn't want to experience themselves as coercing or as taking something. They wanted to be together with their wives. And so the other side of splitting is trying to integrate and have a mutual and intersubjective experience together with their own spouses.
Okay, so your experience is that men actually, that many men, and the men that you have studied, have succeeded to integrate their sexuality, and that in fact, contrary to what might be the attitude about men, that the kind of toxic masculine man who is willing to coerce his wife, or who uses his patriarchal stance to demand relations from his wife. What you're saying is that your research did not bear this out. Men want to have a mutual relationship. They want to have a consensual relationship. They're not interested in duty sex or in pity sex. They want sex which is with a partner who is there, who is present, who is engaged. What is your research say about how prepared men are in terms of knowing what they like and knowing what their partners like? What is the state of sexual education for men? And maybe you can draw on some of the experience in Israel. Specifically also, and I know that you've been a listener to our podcast from the beginning, specifically about the existential conflict of, needing to repress your sexuality because of the prohibition on masturbation, and then suddenly having sex be completely approved in certain situations. How do men navigate that? How do they learn how to do that? What's your experience, and what can you offer in terms of development, education for our listeners that want to know how to raise sexually healthy young men?
So I think I'm going to relate to the split as a positive thing, because the men that joined my research, so they didn't really have much of a difficulty experiencing the transition from sexuality being a prohibition into marriage and sexuality being a mitzvah. For them, it wasn't an issue. I know for many women, it's a great area of conflict, but for them, it wasn't so much. But we can relate to masturbation and having experience or other like self-centered sexual experiences that bear the burden of shame and guilt. And it was very, very different from the experience they had in their mutual experiences. I mean, when they were experiencing themselves as having a mutual sexuality, they didn't have a lot of shame, or they didn't carry on the guilt and the shame from their years of youth, or even from their experiences as married people.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question along that line. What you're saying in actuality is that the lust-love split is actually useful in the sense that lust belongs to self-satisfying, fantasizing, the kind of arousal that I should not be involved in, as opposed to making love with my wife, which is, I lost you, there you are, which is a mitzvah, which is a positive commandment, and I can then concentrate on my sexuality in a positive way. But what about the need for integration anyway? Because not always is your wife going to be available to you, and maybe she has a sexual pain disorder, or maybe there are other situations where, it's not always available to you when you want it, when you're aroused or when you're in the mood to experience your sexuality in that way. So how do you then find the integration working? I mean, men will still need to masturbate even when they're married. They can't just expect that they can necessarily channel all their sexuality 100% because there are two people involved.
So I think different men experience and handle this tension in very, very different ways on different levels of success. But in general, I think, first of all, they wanted to succeed. I mean, they did have the values to say, I want to have my sexuality with my wife. Maybe I'm not succeeding. Yes, it completely might happen, but that's something I do want.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Scott?
Yeah, I just want to ask Sara if she agrees with what Hananel is saying, because it sounds like they're coming from really different perspectives, that what Hananel is saying is a very positive thing might for Sara be something which leads to people having affairs or extramarital experiences. Am I right, Sarah, or am I reading this wrong?
So Hananel's clients or participants of his studies seem to be where my clients are later on. So they first come in with the infidelity and the affairs, and they're talking about their confusion, not understanding, and a lot of the guilt, and then later on moving towards what Hananel is describing of wanting to learn to integrate and wanting to find a way to be able to experience all their sexual desires and their fantasies and their pleasures with their wife. So that would be a later stage in the treatment.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, and the world is very broad. So some men are like this and some men are like that. But I think it is important for me to emphasize that some men are succeeding. And we can tell our sons, yes, you might succeed. I mean, I've met with men that don't masturbate and didn't masturbate in their past. Okay, so maybe it's something that, of course, not the whole society can do, but it's not an impossible mission.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks. Let's hear a little bit from Shai, and then I'm sure we're going to have more. We have some questions already, and if you have questions, you can write them in the chat box. I doubt we're going to be able to have time to call on people, so you can go ahead and write your questions in, and if we get to them, we'll be happy to answer them. But my question to you, Shai, was the same question that I had before, which has to do with how you experience the men in your clinic, what sort of vulnerabilities they might, or anxieties they might come with, and some ways in which you would like to add your expertise and your experience to this conversation.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Thanks. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. So I think there are a couple things both Hananel and Sarah brought up that I think are really very important. But one of the central issues that comes up a lot with men who I'm working with is the expectation that their sexuality should be something they can control, and choosing what they're aroused by, when they feel desire, what their sexual experience should be like. And in most ways, our sexual experiences are not things we can control, right? Jack Moran talked about this in his book, The Erotic Mind, that the way that our erotic selves, the way our sexual selves develop is oftentimes way below the surface of our consciousness. And we don't really have the ability, number one, to choose on a psychological or emotional level, what are the things we're attracted to? What are the things we're aroused by? And we secondarily have no control over how our bodies physically operate, right? As much as men would like to think that things like erectile function are things that they can just choose when they want to have and choose when they don't want to have, those are not things people choose. And, if you think about things like teenagers in high school who, testosterone is much higher and, their bodies respond to either subconscious cues or purely physiological or anatomical cues. And those are things that a teenager might not want to experience in high school. And there are times when men across the lifespan would want to be able to have sex or engage in physical intimacy with their spouses, and their bodies don't respond the way they'd like to. And so there's a lot of shame and a lot of guilt associated with how men's bodies operate. And in many cases, and this is, I think, profoundly linked to things like cultural expectations and societal expectations that links sexual function with masculinity, right? So how do men define themselves? It's by erectile function, or their ability to create pleasure for their partners. And the link between that sexual function and their masculinity becomes so deeply ingrained in their identity that anything that kind of rattles or shakes that sense of security conjures up huge amounts of anxiety. And I think a big part of this does come from an evolutionary drive when we think about our ability to procreate and our ability to maintain our standings in our communities and maintain our standings with our partners, that there's this strong evolutionary link between what our bodies do and whether or not we're accepted. And I think this kind of runs into our underlying psychological functioning, our underlying psychological needs, that anything that kind of rattles that sense of security in who we are conjures up huge amounts of discomfort. And one of the, I think, challenging things that shows up with that is that as we kind of get caught in our mind with their thoughts and the emotions and the expectations and the norms and what other people are thinking, and so on, we actually can get lost in those thoughts. And when we get lost in those thoughts, our body actually responds to that. So in many ways, the way our body responds ends up kind of feeding into the anxiety associated with that, which ends up contributing even more to how our body responds to that. And then we have this shame and this guilt and this embarrassment that's tied into what our bodies do, what our minds desire, which are oftentimes things that we don't really have control over. And I think this contributes to this pretty powerful, pretty vicious cycle that many men experience. I think especially as men across the lifespan, as testosterone changes and vascular health changes and general physical functioning changes, many of man's sexual response changes also. And there's a lot of we hold on to kind of what our bodies were, what our minds were in our youth, and then when those things change over the lifespan, it's hard to let go of those things, and it contributes to a lot of shame and embarrassment and guilt with how our bodies operate.
Okay, great. So I'm hearing you, and I'm understanding more about why you practice mindfulness and in your practice, and I'm wondering if you could say a couple of words about it, and then I want to open it up to the three of you to say something about pornography. I think that if we have a whole evening on male sexuality and religious men, and not talk, it wouldn't be okay to not mention it as it being quite a big issue. So I'm going to start with you, Shai, since we're already speaking, and I'm sure that you get many religious men who come to you with that tension that they're trying to balance between what they consider to be healthy sexuality according to their values and some sort of trying to integrate it, or maybe not trying to integrate it, trying to separate it from their pornography use that they are likely to see as either compulsive or addictive or problematic, regardless of the frequency. But that's something I'd love for you to comment on.
Sure. So you brought up a couple of interesting points, one of which being the role of mindfulness and the role of values as it relates to how people approach their sexual relationships, and also the dynamic that pornography plays into that. So just to speak very briefly about what mindfulness is and why mindfulness is a really core part of the work that I do, and why I think it's an important part to how people approach their sexual relationships. Mindfulness is most classically defined as contact with the present moment. It's awareness of what's happening in the here and now. And a part of why that's so important is that our minds naturally take us for walks. Our minds take us into the future, worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next month. And that future-oriented pull, that's really where the world of anxiety lives. Our mind pulls us into this world of the unknown, into the things that might go wrong or the things that we may struggle with in the future. And our minds may also pull us into the past, into the world of painful memories, painful experiences. And that's often where things like depression and things like grief and things like loss and things like trauma live. And if our minds kind of pull us into the future, or our mind pulls us into the past, it becomes increasingly difficult to engage in a meaningful way in the present, right? Like if you imagine like sitting down to, eat a hamburger, and the entire time you're thinking about something you're supposed to do tomorrow, you're not really going to be able to enjoy what it is you're doing in the moment. And part of how both for men and women, how our bodies operate is that the stage of the process that goes into the sexual response cycle requires certain levels of sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system activation, which basically is either how relaxed you are or how tense or how reactive your body is. And earlier in the sexual response cycle, it's important for your mind and body to experience relaxation. And that's a necessary requisite for your body to engage in sexual desire and sexual arousals, for your body to be kind of more relaxed. But if our minds are kind of pulling us into all these different places, it's kind of hard to be grounded in what it is that we're doing. And if you're not present in what it is that you're doing, number one, it's hard to just enjoy where you are. But number two is your body is likely to respond to the thoughts or the emotions that are getting stirred up internally, if it's thoughts about the future or painful thoughts about the past. So I see this actually quite a lot with people who've experienced sexual trauma, that they experience something painful, either physically painful or emotionally painful in the past, and they may be in the present moment with their spouse, but their mind pulls them into memories, and then their body might tighten up. There could be tension. That's where you may see business or pain, or men losing their erections. And so, our mind's kind of pulling at all those different places makes it really difficult to engage in a meaningful way in what it is we're doing in the present. So mindfulness is the practice of non-judgmentally and flexibly bringing your attention to the present. And we could do this through things like mindful breathing or body awareness exercises, or things like visualization exercises that kind of bring us into the present moment. And those kinds of practices can be really, really important, quite frankly, not just for a person's sexual experience, but also their general engagement with whatever it is that they're doing. If it means, having a conversation with someone, or eating something, or listening to music, how grounded are you? How connected are you in the present moment? And these poles our minds take us to these different places oftentimes interferes not just with our ability to engage in a meaningful way, but also how our bodies respond in those moments. So that's really why I think in general, one of the keystones to meaningful and value congruent sexual activity is, are we present? Are we mindful? And I think that's one of the core functions of the work that I try to integrate, and not just in sexual health, but also in treating things like depression and trauma and anxiety disorders and so on.
I'm going to move on to our other panelists, but I just want to make a comment on what you're saying, because I don't know if you or Sara or Hananel, I'm sure you've seen this, but a very popular slide that is presented at a lot of lectures on male sexuality and female sexuality is a slide that depicts like a lot of different panels and switches, and that's supposed to be women's sexual response. And then for men, there's like one little switch that you just turn on. And whenever I see that slide, I get very annoyed, because it is such a reductionist view of the complexity of what happens to men. Because of what you're saying, there is such a tendency towards performance anxiety and such a racing ahead of what ifs and what if, and to the extent that they're not able to even be present in the experience and enjoy it. And this is why we're doing our panel, because the idea that male sexuality can be reduced to just flick a switch and you're always ready, willing, and able really gives the wrong idea to men and to their partners. So thanks for bringing that up. All right, Sara, can you talk for a moment about the pornography issue, or anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, I would like to say that whenever I see that slide, it makes me really angry, because that's not my experience with my male clients. They want to have good sex lives. They want to please their wives. They're anxious about not pleasing them. They're anxious about their performance. Sex matters to them. It's not just about like, oh, I show up, I have my erection, I'm ready. It's a lot more meaningful and detailed and important to them. And it's not just about pleasure. There's a lot of emphasis on pleasure for their wives, which I'll segue this into porn. I think that's the main issue for me when I think about porn, is that it reinforces that split of a love and lust. Porn, you're really very often just seeing lust, and you're seeing the male performers coming in ready. They can go for many hours. We're not seeing the behind the scenes of what goes in to putting on this porn set. So I think it, creates a lot of insecurity for men and high expectations for men that they don't, that they can't live up to, and it's really not accurate. And unfortunately, for many young boys, this is their first sex education, is porn. And now not just they have a misconception of what sex looks like, but now they also have sex is dirty, because culture, both secular and orthodox, demonizes porn, and porn is considered bad. And I can't even count the amount of clients who come in and ask me if they're sex addicts because they watch porn once a week, or once every second week. So now their education about sex is, oh, it's just performance-based, and porn is bad, which means sex is bad. Which again reinforces this split between love and lust, that sexual desires is dirty and love is pure. I also want to add that in my research that I've just finished, men who say that they're insecure about their masculinity report that they would cheat. Like when we asked them different questions regarding infidelity, they answered that they would cheat, but actually if we looked at their history and we asked them, did you or did you not cheat? The answer was no, which shows that they're going to engage in this locker room banter and they're going to say these things that make them look macho and what they think a masculine man would say, but they actually don't act on it, which is very comforting, but also really sad to know that men need to put up this performance because they think that this is what makes them masculine or this is what makes them a man.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Scott, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to ask Sara a question based on what she just said, because I'm a little bit confused. What would you suggest a client, I mean, the typical client, if such a thing exists, do in a situation where they've been conditioned to believe that porn is sex, porn is dirty, therefore sex is dirty? Is the answer, I mean, the answer might be, well, then don't watch porn, but we're talking about somebody who already has watched porn. So is the answer to say, well, don't think of porn as dirty? That might not be so great either, because that gives them certain performance anxiety, because if that's the way sex is supposed to be, then I can't do that. So what would you suggest to a typical client who comes to you with that issue?
That's a really good question, because I don't want to say that porn is dirty. What I do is educate how porn is made, what the purpose of porn is, and what the problem of porn is. And the biggest issue is, again, it detaches you from reality. It's not based in reality. And then I really kind of like break down the porn set. And I say, like, there's cameras and there's so much that goes into making the man and the woman look a very specific way. Which helps. Once I give my clients the background, I find that often they have this aha moment of, okay, this is completely a movie, not based in reality. Sometimes I might find it helpful. Sometimes I might find this to be an escape. But in the same way that I'm not trying to be Brad Pitt, I'm not going to try to be replaying my porn movies.
Yeah, and an additional factor too is that while we think that many men, especially religious men, are conflicted with porn use because of their values, there's often a lot more going on in terms of what their actual conflict is. Some men are very disturbed by what they find turns them on in porn, and they actually the therapy is not so much about balancing your values or integrating what you're doing, but it's really about talking about what it is you're watching, what it is for you, why you think, why it's having that effect. It may just be that, well, we all respond to different types of things and it doesn't mean anything. And it may actually have something that we need to be able to explore. So I do want to get Hananel's take on the pornography question, and then we'll go back to you, Shai, because I saw your hand up. So Hananel?
So I think many men are not connected to their desires and their wishes, and they don't even ask themselves, what do I want? Right. What do I lust? They just perform, and they're disconnected from their internal experience. And this is also why Shai's work and the mindfulness is so important. And I would like to have 3 bullets on pornography. And first of all, I think we should recognize that we live in a pornified sphere. We don't need to actually watch porn in order to consume the ideas and ideals that porn is all scattered and is all about. The second point is that pornography is not like watching professional people doing something in a very amazing and impressive way. I think porn is a bad model for sexuality. Like, if you will adhere to that, it will be bad for you and of course for your spouse. So it's like learning how to eat from watching fast food industry. It's mainly wrong, and that takes me to the third point, is that I think, recognizing that we live in a pornified sphere, the sphere we should go is exploring our own and our mutual experience. Because I think when we're inserted in an interaction, it actually draws us outside of our own box of experience. So it can maybe redeem some of the very, very hard box that the pornified sphere is implementing into our minds and also into our bodies.
Okay. Thanks for that. And Shai, you wanted to add something about pornography. And I'm also interested if you as a therapist and Hananel as a therapist would bring that to your clients, or patients about porn being bad. And the idea of you as the therapist with your clear values about pornography, how do you navigate that in your work?
So I think both Hananel and Sara are bringing a really valuable and important point. And I think this is a conversation that could quite easily be a 2 or 3 hour panel discussion. So I think trying to compress this into like a 10-minute part of a talk is not going to do it fully
justice. That's why we're having a course.
Right.
So sign up for that coming up.
So a couple of points. One is I think that the amount of guilt and shame associated with pornography runs through, I think, not just in Judaism, but runs through culture and religion in many different ways. And I think one of the important things that I do, and I think a good chunk of the patients who I work with have reports about concern about their pornography use, is number one is to destigmatize that a little bit, to talk about the fact that the desire that draws towards pornography is normal, right? That this is a part of why it's a hotly debated topic of whether or not pornography addiction is even a thing, or sex addiction is even a thing, right? There's literature that argues that the reason that this is not a diagnosable condition is because these are normal biological, physiological, psychological drives. So I think on the one hand to normalize that process in many ways. And I don't impart about is porn good, bad, right, or wrong, but talk more about is pornography consistent or inconsistent with your values? Because when we talk about pornography being good or bad or right and wrong, we create a culture or a stigma associated with our sexuality. And I think that can do a lot of damage. So I certainly take the stance of not is what you're doing good or bad, but is what you're doing what you want or what you don't want. So I think that's a big part of what I kind of draw into this. And I think to Sarah's point before as well, she was talking about kind of the expectations people create. A good chunk, I think, of what the work that I do is education, right? So when we talk about things like the implicit model, which without going into detail is just a kind of a gradually increasing level of intervention when people are presenting with sexual concerns, a chunk of that or a significant portion of that is educating people, is understanding what is normal, what is considered healthy, how long does a typical man last during intercourse, for example, and kind of creating normalized expectations helps reduce a lot of the stigma and shame associated with things like sexual function, and kind of steering away from the idea of looking at sex as a performance. So whenever a man talks about I couldn't perform, I immediately talk about let's define what you actually mean here, because when we talk about sex as a performance, it creates expectation that you have to perform something, and if you're not performing, you are failing at your job. And so I kind of try to steer away from that as a general model and kind of creating normalized expectations of here's how your mind operates, here's how your body operates, and trying to take some of the stigma and shame associated with this off the table.
Okay, great. So Scott, I know you had one more question for the panel, and we are running out of time. And we also had a question that I kind of wanted to throw out based on the questions that came in. So I'm just going to ask mine really quick and then ask you to bring up your question. You know, we work with a ultra-Orthodox population, and we hear stories of young men who were beaten up for masturbating or were really very, very shamed for it. One of the questions came in about a man who's in a relationship with his wife, and he was told that his sexual desires in his adolescence were evil and that he would go to hell for masturbating. He was regularly beat up by his Rebbe. I'm being asked to ask you how Rebbes can talk about male sexuality in a positive way. I know that Scott and I have dealt with this in previous episodes, but I'm happy to hear what you might, as sexual health professionals, have to add to that conversation. Who wants to talk about that? Sara, Shai, or Hananel? Hananel, do you want to jump in with that? As a rabbi and
sure.
psychologist.
So, I mean, from what I've experienced and met from rabbis, so in Judaism, there is a positive perspective about sexuality and about the yetzer. The yetzer that brings life, and there is a lot of space for that. But on the other side, there is also a lot of space for the yetzer to be bad. Like the normal yetzer hara, is the sexual drive. So there is, I mean, we do have those both sides. And I think even the stories in Kiddushin about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, they give us a great lesson. These rabbis were mocking people who couldn't stand in front of their yetzer. And they have been taught in an experiential way that this is a very serious and hard conflict for many people. And therefore, we should be very empathic, and we should validate everybody that are struggling with these issues, because it's really hard. And especially in our culture, when people are getting married later and later in life. So they've got so many years of living with an unfulfilled yearning. And with it, in addition to living in a pornified sphere, at least in the modern Orthodox community, this is usually the case. So it's really, really hard, and sometimes it is impossible, and we do fail, and failing is part of life, and also of Jewish and spiritual life.
Thank you. Sara, when the damage has been done and they were not given the kind of education the way that you presented, Hananel, but rather they were, as presented in this question, shamed, degraded, beaten. In some cases, we know that boys from yeshivas who masturbate are given medication to lower their sex drive so that they won't masturbate. I mean, I think that we know that the experience of shame and conflict and guilt around masturbation can be very great. And the damage is done. How do you deal with that in your therapy practice?
First, it's a very long road. And I would say the first step is for the client first to acknowledge and to recognize that this was damage. Very often there's a very flippant reaction to it of big deal. This happened to all my friends, who cares? And then once the client is able to realize that, no, this did cause a lot of damage, they're able to start mourning the loss of what could have been healthy sex education. And then the other piece that starts to play in at that time usually is that they start to also mourn the loss of their relationship and the damage that they've done to their relationship. And they start falling into this catch-22 of, up until now, any feelings of guilt and shame, the way they dealt with it was by escaping to watch porn or go pay for sex or be with their mistress. Now they're working on becoming closer to their wives, but they're also, there's so much shame and guilt being activated that they want to run and escape it by going back to porn or any form of sex. So there's this long period of treatment where they're really struggling between wanting to connect to their wives, but also knowing that as they connect, there's going to be even more guilt about the damage they've done, and even more wanting to escape and having to kind of do a lot of Shai's work of mindfulness and kind of staying there and sitting with the pain and the sadness without wanting to escape it.
Okay, so thank you for that. That's a very empathic response and very compassionate approach. All of you really are presenting a very compassionate approach, which is what men really need. Scott, I want to hear your question. We're getting amazing questions coming in as well, but we are out of time, so I guess we'll have to deal with these questions maybe in our follow-up episode. Scott, your question, which will be our final question.
Yes, let me first thank the panel, because this has been very enlightening. I learned a lot tonight, so thank all of you for joining us, as well as our listeners and everyone sending in great questions. This definitely deserves a follow-up, and as you mentioned, Talli, we will be having a class, so please keep that in mind. But I wanted to ask the panel, not with my hat as a podcast host, but as a Chatan teacher, what is it that each of you would say is currently missing, if you think something is missing, from typical Khatan classes, from your experience, from what you've heard? This sort of follows on what Hananel said and Sara said a moment ago about education, but I'm not really speaking about clients. I'm speaking about the new Khatan who's coming to learn Taharat HaMishpacha, but needs to also learn about healthy sexuality. And it seems that very often the Khatan teacher is the address where that's supposed to be conveyed. So what would each of you recommend be added to the curriculum of Khatan classes, which isn't there now, which needs to be there in order to foster healthy relationships? Sara, why don't I start with you?
I'm the moderator.
Okay, sorry.
Shai, can you start?
Sure. It's a great question. I've actually done some Khatan classes also, so I try to integrate this into those classes as well. I think, again, this could be a really lengthy conversation of talking about how to integrate Jewish values and halakha and sexual health and sexual practices. So I think some of the things that are important is how to communicate with your partner about sex and intimacy, and how to talk about what works and what doesn't work, and exploring things together, and sex being a dynamic thing, and that sex at the beginning of a marriage and sex towards the end of a marriage are not the same things. Understanding how to evolve together as a couple is really rooted in how you communicate. And so I think open communication, I think, is a really, really critical skill. And even how to talk about your own experiences, right? How to open up about your own experiences, how to reflect about your own experiences is an important thing in how we communicate to our partners. Another thing I think is important to talk about is what normal responses are during sex. So I've had many cases where a man had one early traumatic sexual experience that permeates every other sexual experience that follows. So a man who, let's say, his first sexual encounter was not able to get and maintain an erection, and now every subsequent sexual encounter, that's the thought that goes through his mind. So understanding what are normal things that happen during a sexual encounter. When is it time to reach out for help? When should you, identify, or how do you identify it's time to talk to a doctor or to a therapist? That there are many situations in which man will feel shame or guilt and say, "I'll keep it to myself." In some cases, avoid sex with his wife because he doesn't want to be in a position where he feels that guilt or shame. And sometimes that manifests in relationship difficulties. So what looks like a marital discord is actually not marital discord. It's the consequence of sexual dysfunction that is manifesting as that discord, because the man would say, "I'd rather my wife be angry at me than have to feel the shame or guilt associated with not being able to maintain my sexual function." So I think one part of it is—
I'm going to cut you off just because we are really we're past the time.
Sure.
And I want to give our other panelists time to just give in their thoughts so that we can end. So thank you so much for that, Sara.
Sure.
Well, one sentence I would say is to talk about that sex is great, it's fun, it's exciting, it's a language. Both of you are learning it, the guy and the girl, have fun together, figure it out together. That would be my more of a positive, exciting message.
And Hananel.
In addition to all your great advice, I would really emphasize that for the Khatan, that they're gonna experience a new thing, and always when you're starting to do something, you always fail, and it's completely okay. It's a learning experience. Probably your sexual experience at the beginning will be far worse than what is expecting to you ahead, and really to be open to failing, and it's okay. Things will be weird and messy, and in the end you'll find your way if you'll be consistent with searching for the way. Like, don't assume like, there's a very clear path and you can fail or succeed. You don't know.
I love that. The only thing I would add to that is I would maybe change the language of failing and succeeding, and just change it to kind of experiencing, because we already see how couples come to the marriage with those words of, I need to succeed, we need to get it right, and we failed and we didn't, and so I would change that language, that it's not about failing or succeeding, because it's a journey. It's kind of like riding a bicycle. You fall off on the way until you get it right. So great. Thank you very much. Thanks again to our amazing panelists, and thank you to our listeners. We really went over time and did not get to all the questions, but we will probably, Scott, I think we'll do a follow-up.
I think that's inevitable, Talli.
Where we will address the questions, and then we will also start planning our course. So thanks again, everybody, and good night.
And I also want to thank everyone on the panel again, Hananel Ross, Krug, Sara Schapiro-Halberstam. It was really great having you all with us once again. And remember to listen to this podcast. Go to intimatejudaism.com. This will also be available on our Facebook page as well as on YouTube. Please share it, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.